Afternoon. I'd like everybody to just take a moment and take a pause. Just take a deep breath. Center yourself and focus to prepare yourself for our afternoon speaker. It's my honor to welcome Jonathan Rose, who is the President CEO of Jonathan Rose Companies. He's an innovator and a visionary in the field of real estate development. His company is a for-profit company that is for a purpose, building on the theme from this morning. They have the mission to repair the fabric of our communities, which is not a small order. They seek nothing less than transformative change in our communities. I've spent some time on Jonathan's website. You have his bio in your packet, because I was intrigued to find out how somebody seeks transformative change through a for-profit real estate, environmentally sustainable company. And I encourage you to check it out yourselves because it expresses the company's approach to their work. But what's most intriguing is that he actually has a list of books that have inspired him and a music playlist. There's Bob Dylan and Tracy Chapman, Bob Marley, there's Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and that got me thinking. Consider, if you will, what a jazz ensemble does, right? There's improvisation, there's solos, there's also that underlying rhythm and syncopation that keeps it all together. And I thought, I think Jonathan is like the conductor of a jazz ensemble. He's pulling together themes of diversity, environmental sustainability, infrastructure, environmental responsibility, livelihood, all with this overarching theme of interdependence for the good of strengthening our community. And I think that's a really cool way to approach your work, whether it's for-profit, for-purpose, nonprofit, mission-driven, value-driven. It has tremendous impact when you think about things in the terms of interdependence and your values. Great music is made from notes, but it's also the pauses between them. It's the silences, which is why I ask everybody to just take a moment and breathe. Many of you may have checked out the table for the Garrison Institute, which is another venture of Jonathan and his wife, Deanna Calthorpe Rose, who's here with us today. We are encouraged to find our silence at Garrison Institute, to know the power of contemplative practice, of gaining insight and vision for all the work that we're trying to do, which is to repair the world. So today is a busy day, but find moments to pause and gather your own sense of vision and mission. Take a deep breath and welcome Jonathan Rose.
Wow. That was the best intro I've ever had. Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate it. That was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. And I'm so honored to be here with all of you. You have spent so much of your lives focused on repairing the fabric of community, and I really salute your work. So we live in a very complicated time. This happens to be it's a very volatile time. The military in about 1998 named this an age of VUCA age, an age of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That the volatility that we're facing is not only leading to uncertainty, but because systems are so complex now, you can't really tell what the outcome of any specific trend is going to be or how it's going to affect you. What I'm going to talk about today is how do we actually try and make sense of a VUCA age, and how do we do our work, which is to heal people, to heal the environment, all the wonderful work that you're all doing in Westchester County and Putnam. How do we do this work in a VUCA age? So there's weather VUCA that's going on. This happens to be a dust storm that hit Phoenix. The tsunami that just came out of nowhere and swept the coast of Japan, and it was followed by an earthquake, leaving families homeless. We've seen incredible unexpected winter storms. This happens to have been in Chicago. Last winter we had one in Boston where they were just snowed in forever. That's too much water in a way at one period of time, and the other part, huge parts of America are now suffering from droughts. This is Southern California. And although there is a little more rain this year, the whole Southwest is probably into generations and generations of having to deal in a low water environment. It's leading to fires too. This is in Colorado. And we're seeing enormous changes to our climate. And all of us are affected by climate change. This is a photograph in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And this is what the air looks like on a typical day. I think it's kind of interesting in the Chinese propaganda machine that they feel they have to show this enormous TV screen showing how beautiful China really is, because most people don't have an experience of that. We've also seen enormous financial volatility, particularly the volatility that took place in 2007, 8, 9. And as a consequence of that, one of the things we know is that America, although the economy has come back, it has come back less equal than ever before, that more families have not recovered from the economy, that the volatility of that period actually revealed that the landscape of equality and opportunity in America is not equal, and it became more and more unequal in that time. And all of you are dealing with that in your work. At the same time, the world is rapidly urbanizing. By 2050, by 2080, over 80% of the world's population is projected to live in cities. And these cities will be cities between 1 and 10 million people. There are larger cities throughout the world. At any rate, we're going to see continued urbanization in the United States. But for example, New York City, our country's largest city, is projected to grow by about 1 million or 1.5 million people over that time, where there are many cities around the world that will grow by 5 or 8 million people. So a much, much larger trend globally than in the United States. I mentioned the population will grow to about 10 billion people, where it's expected to stabilize towards the end of the century, and we really do not have the systems planned or to figure out how to deal with such a huge population in these rapidly growing cities, leading to enormous traffic jams and more pollution. At the same time, the good news is that the world is beginning to move out of a lot of poverty. There certainly continues to be poverty throughout the world, but to a rising middle class. But the middle class is consuming as they never consumed before, and that is taking billions of people who are now buying all kinds of things. And to buy those things requires the cutting of trees and the mining of fuel, of things from the earth, and the use of fossil fuels, etc. These are also having huge negative environmental impacts. The creation of these goods in much of the world is a very toxic activity. I've mentioned that as our cities are growing, we're seeing this huge growth in inequality. This happens to be in Sao Paulo, and you can see this gated luxury community with swimming pools and its own private schools, and literally right next to it is a great slum. This inequality is creating an enormous amount of social unrest around the world. In 2011, there were riots in London, completely unexpected. This is a map of London, and the deeper the red on the map, the poorer the community. And all those little Google dots show where there was a riot. And what's interesting is you see the riots were not in the poorest parts of the city. The riots were actually in the parts where the lower middle class met the middle class. And they were faced with what was really an insurmountable, although invisible, line. And the young people from these lower middle class, primarily immigrant families, who felt there was just no way that they could move forward with their lives and into the next level in England, out of that frustration, that was the cause of the riots. And although we have not seen riots in the United States, there are more and more, tens of millions of Americans who also feel like they're facing a line that they cannot surmount. And finally, a result of many of these trends, but particularly climate change, we are seeing wars all over the world and climate activity that is displacing people. There are 60 million refugees in the world today. And these people are desperately seeking exactly what we seek. They want a stable home, a place to raise their kids, health care, education, housing that they can trust, and work that they can do. If you look carefully in this picture, so this is in Syria, you'll see look at it, the families are wearing leather jackets and ties. These are well-dressed families and they're in a food line. Their lives, these are middle-class people who've had the very basis of their life ripped out from them. And these are people who want to come to our country and many others to rebuild their lives. So how do we think about all this? And in searching for ideas, I'm so glad Laura mentioned my interest in music. because I came upon this idea of temperament. Musically, temperament is an idea of finding a mean. So what happened was that Pythagoras, about 2,000 years ago, said that, notice that there was a relationship between the notes in a scale. I'm going to move aside from that mic. That there was a relationship between the notes in a scale, the proportions between the notes, and the proportions between the planets in the universe. And he called this the music of the spheres, and he said that every scale should be tuned just like the planets. And they sounded very beautiful like that, but it turns out that each scale was slightly different, and if you tried to put them together, they sounded horrible. It was not until the 1600s that we actually figured out a system called temperament, and what temperament did is it found the average between the scales so that you could move from scale to scale. And that created a musical system called well-tempered. That required a new technology for music making, and the new technology happened to have been the clavier, which then became the piano. And out of that, Bach created this extraordinary piece of music called the well-tempered clavier, which was designed as a guidebook for how you use this new musical system of temperament. And it included every note on the keyboard and in every possible combination of harmony. Literally goes through all the major minor keys. And if you just look at the sweep of the notes, you can see it's a magnificent piece of music, and what he was trying to do is actually reflect the architecture of the universe. A great spiritual aspiration, but made palpable here on Earth. So taking these ideas, I asked the question, can we find a tempering system? Can we find ways to use our new technologies of information and tie them together to help solve the issues of the VUCA era, and in ourselves and in our work also create works of great harmony? So I'm going to begin and talk to you about the idea of coherence, and I'm going to begin with planning. This is a pile of environmental impact statements, and the way we typically plan our communities in Westchester is we have master plans and zoning codes and environmental impact statements. And if you think about how well the environment is doing or not doing, is traffic getting better or worse, this system from the 1970s is really an outdated system that is no longer serving us well. So the question is there a new way that we can begin to plan? Now, I mentioned that the temperament system started with a new technology, and we have amazing technologies now, which are the Internet of Things, big data. We can now sense enormous amount about environmental impact, human impact, social impact, healthcare outcomes. We can sense weather trends. We can understand the impact of climate change. We can see rising heat levels. We can understand the flow of toxicity through our environment. Many, many, many things. We have healthcare data that comes from the public health system. And we can integrate this all. This is the Operations Center in Rio. This is actually the first place they really tried to do this and ask the question, can we use this new technology, multi-sensing, to be able to figure out how to actually deliver government services better and to plan better, and maybe we could plan more coherently. To do that, you need a vision. This is a vision that a sustainability group in Portland came up for themselves. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that first of all, for Portland, those are denser, taller buildings. They believe in density. If you look on the roof of it, there are windmills. This image is to say, therefore, we want green power. If you look on the street, what you'll see is a car, a bus, a light rail, a streetcar, actually, somebody riding a bicycle, people walking. So what they were saying in this image is we want to integrate multiple modes of transportation. You'll see children, you'll see older people, you'll see a park across the street. This says Oregon grown, it's local, fresh food. So in this one image, they tried to put out to the public a vision of where they wanted the overall city and their region to go. This is very enthusiastically accepted. So I said, first we need a basis of data. We need to understand, and we can now understand our current circumstances. We need a vision. And then we need to take that and turn that into metrics. This happens to be the Santa Monica Sustainability Index. There are many, many now. These are called community health indicators. And although it's hard to read, if you look along this, all the categories, there's energy use and water use and affordable housing, bus ridership, there are health data, there's academic performance, all kinds of indicators. And you, any community, can get together. It's actually a fantastic exercise and say, who do we want to become? And how would we measure them? What are the indicators of those? And you begin to map how well or poorly you're doing on those. And you can align that with your earlier sense of vision. So what happens is now, if you look on the chart on the left, the 9 o'clock, it says establish community health indicators. You can tie those into a master plan. The government has the tools of regulations, such as building codes, example. Regulations generally tell us what's the minimum that we can do. But you can also invest in infrastructure. You can create incentives. Incentives actually try and encourage us to do the best that we can do. And governments and not-for-profits can show leadership. And that creates change, and you can measure those outcomes, compare how you're doing the community health indicators, and keep adjusting. We tend to make very static plans, 20-year plans, master plans, or institutional plans, hospital plans, daycare plans, and then we kind of carry those out. In the VUCA age, we need to be much more dynamic because these circumstances around us are continually changing, and so we need to change with them. So this dynamic system and the new technologies that are available to allow us to measure, if we have clear goals and a vision, will help us achieve that coherence. The second thing then is what happens is begin to create something we call circularity, which is, as Laura mentioned in her introduction, how things are interdependent. And when we really begin to see deep interdependence and we can see how everything is interconnected, we find that there's enormous benefit in interconnection. Think about nature, where oxygen is breathed out by trees. Humans breathe it in. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and trees breathe in carbon dioxide. That carbon cycle that we learned about when we were kids in school, we can take those ideas and begin to build them into every aspect of the way our city and county works. So watch this. We have enormous stormwater waste problems now. Most our stormwater systems, when they're heavy rains, and because of climate change, they're going to be heavier rains, overflow. And that overflow pollutes the seas and rivers and the ocean. So but we can take that, we can actually purify it. I'm going to show you some examples and turn that back into fresh water. We can take organic waste and purify that and turn that back into compost and use it for growing food. We can take solid waste and create construction materials, and so on and so on. We can take heat and waste energy. I'll show you an example of that, and begin to connect it and reuse it as energy. What happens when you create these cycles is, number one, you create local jobs. All these systems, when you're taking what was waste and you turn it back into input, and these tend to be blue-collar and working-class jobs. It also creates engineering jobs, which I also believe are very important for our local economy. Number two, one of the issues of, remember I mentioned that we're going to reach 10 billion people and we're consuming more and more. So one of the problems is we're going to begin to see resource shortages. When China had an enormous boom, the cost of concrete and steel in the United States skyrocketed for construction. They've calmed down now in some of their building in China, so our costs have gone down. But because we're a global society, we're deeply interlinked. When you can start harvesting materials locally and reusing them, you isolate yourself from the global economy in some ways, and you build more resilience that way, which is very, very important. So local jobs, local resilience, and it's obviously much, much better for the environment. This is a water treatment plant in Windhoek, Namibia. It's the capital of Namibia. Namibia is a desert country, and as it was growing, they were running out of water. This is the first place in the world about 40 years ago where they took their sewer water, purify it completely, treat it, and put it back into the drinking water side and reuse it. They have a phrase there that scientists who developed the system said, we should judge water by its quality and not by its history. This has run for 40 years without ever having a negative incident. And we're now seeing that this system, so here's Windhoek, was able to grow dramatically. The city tripled in size because it was able to triple its water supply. So we're now seeing that this kind of cycle, it has to be part of the solution to the droughts that we're seeing in the Southwest. Another thing about water treatment plants, it turns out that wastewater treatment plants create about 2.5% of climate change gases. But what's interesting is if you take the sludge and clean it up that comes out of them and reuse that for fertilizer, you can save another 2 or 3% of greenhouse gases. There's another interesting thing, which is one of the biggest jobs that wastewater treatment plants do, is they remove phosphorus and nitrogen from the water supply. That's part of the pollution. Turns out that what is fertilizer made out of but phosphorus and nitrogen? And this plant, which is in the Blue Plains, Virginia, discovered that they could actually make money. So they spend about $100 a ton removing the phosphorus and nitrogen. They sell it for about $500 a ton. So all of a sudden, the wastewater plant has become a factory. It is not only creating more jobs, reducing greenhouse gases, but at the same time, it is actually creating goods to be sold in the local fertilizer economy. So the cycle that I gave you an example of, if you can do it with wastewater treatment plants, you can do it with anything. Okay. As we think about resilient systems, we not only need to be recycling water and stuff, we need to be capturing water. So this is, for example, a tank that captures rainwater off the roof of a building and then purifies it and uses it for gardens and laundry. We already know that we can have distributed systems where we start putting solar on the roofs of buildings. So we can start beginning to think of all of our systems. So another pathway to resilience in a volatile time is distributed systems rather than centralized systems. So this is a map of a microgrid, a community-wide microgrid, and it's a new way of thinking about electricity. So currently in Westchester, we get our electricity from Con Ed, comes out of big power plants. It's very, very reliable. But it's hard to adjust actually to the vagaries of use. So in this case, if you look in the lower left, it says cogeneration, and that is providing electricity and heat to office buildings and schools. But everything you see ties into this central energy control system. There's utility power system, photovoltaic, wind power, power generated from industrial waste, fuel cells, sewage sludge treatment, electrical capacitors to use for storage, et cetera. And what you get is a much more complicated system, but you get one that is much more dynamic, one that has much lower environmental impact. And what it means is all of a sudden is that people on the system can become both producers and consumers. So you can be both buying electricity at some times and selling electricity at other times. And when you take this loop and make it not only about electricity, but about heat, it gets very, very interesting. So for example, there's a system now in Minneapolis in which there are laboratories that are creating a huge amount of heat, and their heat is being taken off and being used then to heat. So as you cool the laboratories, you are actually heating the adjacent nearby hospital. We know that supermarkets, for example, all those cooling cases, even running in the winter, are exhausting waste heat. That's just going into the air, when that can be captured and recycled and used to heat buildings. So as you create this kind of a loop, you create a much more dynamic and integrated system, and it's much more resilient. The other thing we know is that we need to actually reduce load. This is a building that one of our early projects in Westchester called the Burnham Building in Irvington, right next to a train station. And we use this material, a recycled spray-in insulation. So it's newspaper that are chopped up, has many advantages. One is that we're right next to a train station, so as an insulation material, it's much quieter. The second one is that it is fireproofed with borax, and borax is a natural insecticide. And one of the things we know about low-income families is they are hugely impacted by insecticides. Pregnant women who live in particularly low-income housing who are exposed to very high insect loads give birth to lower birth weight and lower intelligence children. So here, the insulation itself is giving them an insect-free home, which means it can be an insecticide-free home. So again, what happens when you begin to recycle is you get to see multiple benefits. This is a building called the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. It has this big roof. The roof collects more rainwater than is needed for them. Then they clean it and clean it and recycle it for the building's toilets and drinking water. It's an office building, et cetera. And that roof also is a solar system, and it collects more power than is needed within the building. So now begin to imagine a system of a city where every building can be like this, where it's what we used to think of waste heat and waste water and waste sewage, et cetera, all being interconnected into a much more dynamic system. This works best in a city that is both dense but very, very green, filled with community gardens. Gardens can be on roofs, they can be on the ground. We also know how gardens absorb stormwater. And we've learned more and more, again, how we can begin to use nature to create resilience against rising seas and climate change. This is part of an imagination, which is now being made real. as to how to deal with climate change in Manhattan. So now I want to talk about resilience in human beings. This is the heat wave of Chicago in 1995. An enormous number of deaths. As a matter of fact, more people in climate change die from sudden and intense heat waves than die from storms, from hurricanes. A scientist, a social scientist named Eric Kleinenberg, did a study to understand where were these deaths. And as you can imagine, the death rate was the lowest in the northern white neighborhoods that were wealthy. And it was the highest in the poorer black neighborhoods in the South. But interestingly, there were two poor black neighborhoods that actually performed better than the white neighborhoods. And the reason why was they had very deep social networks. They had systems-based, church-based systems in which they visited the elderly. They had already had systems to feed the elderly, et cetera. And it was a community of care. And one of the lessons that came from that is with all the technology and all the money and all the systems, that in fact there is extended communities of care, it is social networks, which is the work that you are all doing in the world, that is one of the greatest inoculations against these volatile times. It is one of the greatest strengths that create resilience in communities. And we see this everywhere. In many ways, as we become a more digital society and focus on our phones, we become more isolated. One of the great other things about parks and open space that I mentioned is not only are they places that can absorb stormwater and provide community food, but they're also places for socialization. And this is extremely important as we repair the fabric of communities. We're seeing, by the way, the young people want to work in much more social environments. We're seeing a whole change in the way the office space is working. So what happens if we begin these and put these together? What becomes our model for community? It's a phrase that is growing called developing communities of opportunity. So if you look at it in the lower left, the quadrant, the first thing it says is affordable housing. We now know that it's incredibly important. All the other things we want to do are very hard to do if you don't have affordable housing. I have a friend who says it's very hard to do homework when you're living under a bridge. Another friend who's a doctor in Boston who says, and her name is Megan Sandell, who says that safe, affordable housing is the best inoculation against childhood diseases. So that is the foundation that we have to start with. But people need income, they need jobs, they need access to mass transit, walkable communities, they need arts and culture, they need neighborhood serving markets serving fresh food. We now know how much, again, in neural development is dependent upon good nutrition. They need parks and open space, access to safe, to really affordable health care, and high quality education. I'm sure there are other elements that you are working on that may not be on this chart, but these are some of the main components. And we can measure these actually now, and we can see how well we are in or not in balance. And if there's one takeaway from my talk that I really want to make today, it is that I believe that our moral responsibility is to make sure that every community in America has an equal amount of everything, that every community in America looks like this rather than this. But to understand where we are, we have to begin to map and see where we're out of balance so that we can begin to adjust to it. So I want to talk about, I'm going to begin with affordable housing. This is a project we just completed as partners with the White Plains Housing Authority. In White Plains, it's called the Prelude, and it's about 100 units of affordable housing for families. The White Plains, the city of White Plains has done a fantastic thing and we built in the base of this a job training center that provides, has an amazing community computer center, but also training for people in culinary arts and other things. And I know many of you, I've spoken to several people today who are involved in workforce development, and that's so key to connect affordable housing and then jobs, to put those two things together. I want to talk a little bit about healthcare. This is a chart of all of the OECD nations, and and you can see how much they spend on this combination. So the blue line, the lower line, is how much each country spends on healthcare. In the United States, which is the one circled, I don't know if you can see the blue line, but we spend the most. We spend about 50% more than anybody else in terms of healthcare. The red is what all the other nations spend on affordable housing, social services, preschool, high quality education, healthcare. And what you're seeing is that in total, by them spending more on those things, they actually can spend less on healthcare. So one of the lessons in this is if we have better early childhood preventive health, if we have better schools, education and health are actually deeply interrelated. So it's not a question of us not having enough money. It's a question of reallocating the money from the